June 4, 1943. North Atlantic, 700 miles east of Newfoundland. The USS Bogue, designation CVE-9, pitched violently in 20-foot swells as her flight deck crew struggled to launch a Grumman TBF Avenger. This was no fleet carrier. At 512 feet, she was barely two-thirds the length of a Yorktown-class carrier. Her single catapult, jury-rigged elevator, and wooden flight deck converted from a merchant ship hull made her seem more like a floating warehouse than a warship. Japanese naval intelligence reports circulating through Combined Fleet headquarters in Truk had dismissed these vessels as emergency conversions, evidence of American desperation rather than strength. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself had reviewed assessments concluding that escort carriers lacked the speed, aircraft capacity, and survivability to meaningfully impact naval warfare. They were too slow to operate with battle groups, too small to launch effective strikes, too vulnerable to serve as anything but convoy escorts shepherding merchant vessels. What Japanese admirals failed to understand was that this dismissal represented a fundamental misreading of American naval strategy and industrial capacity. The escort carrier, mocked as inadequate by officers trained to revere the striking power of fleet carriers, would prove decisive in a campaign the Japanese never anticipated fighting. Within 18 months, these humble vessels and their determined crews would systematically destroy the submarine force that Japan depended on for strategic warfare. The very limitations Japanese planners saw as weaknesses, small size, mass production, merchant ship origins, were precisely what made escort carriers effective at the mission they were designed to perform. Every escort carrier operating in the Atlantic and Pacific represented not American weakness, but American understanding that modern naval warfare required specialized vessels optimized for specific missions, rather than multi-purpose fleet units. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese Navy of 1943 operated according to decisive battle doctrine, refined through decades of study and war planning. This philosophy, inherited from Admiral Togo's victory at Tsushima in 1905, held that naval supremacy would be determined by climactic engagements between battle fleets. Aircraft carriers were valued primarily for their ability to strike enemy capital ships before surface engagements commenced. Fleet carriers, large, fast vessels carrying 70 to 90 aircraft, were the embodiment of this doctrine. Carriers like Akagi, Kaga, and Shokaku represented Japan's commitment to aviation as the decisive striking arm. Their aircraft would locate and cripple enemy battle fleets, enabling Japanese surface forces to complete the destruction. This operational concept emphasized concentration of force, speed of maneuver, and overwhelming firepower at the critical point. Submarine warfare received far less attention in Japanese naval planning. Submarines were assigned fleet support roles, scouting, attacking damaged capital ships, harassing enemy formations. The concept of systematic interdiction of merchant shipping, the campaign that had nearly starved Britain in World War I, held minimal appeal for Japanese strategists focused on decisive battle. This philosophical bias would prove catastrophic. While Japanese doctrine emphasized dramatic fleet actions, American submarines were systematically strangling Japan's maritime economy. Japanese merchant losses mounted steadily throughout 1942 and 43. Oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies, freighters carrying raw materials from conquered territories, transport vessels supplying island garrisons, all became targets for American submarine commanders operating with increasing effectiveness. Japanese anti-submarine warfare remained primitive compared to Allied developments. Escort vessels were few, poorly equipped with sonar, and inadequately trained. Air coverage over convoy routes was sporadic. The Imperial Japanese Navy had prioritized offensive striking power over defensive convoy protection, leaving merchant shipping vulnerable to systematic attrition that would ultimately prove more damaging than any surface engagement. American naval doctrine had taken a fundamentally different path. The United States Navy, shaped by two ocean commitments and Britain's experiences in the Atlantic, understood that controlling sea lanes required sustained presence over vast ocean areas. This mission demanded large numbers of vessels rather than concentration of power in a few elite units. The escort carrier concept emerged from these requirements. In 1941, as German U-boats devastated Atlantic convoys, the Royal Navy desperately needed air coverage in the mid-Atlantic gap, where land-based aircraft could not reach. Converting merchant vessels into small carriers offered a solution that could be implemented quickly using existing industrial capacity. The first escort carrier, HMS Audacity, entered service in June 1941. Converted from the captured German merchant ship Hanover, she displaced 10,400 tons and carried 6 fighters. Her career lasted only 6 months before a U-boat sank her in December 1941, but she demonstrated that even minimal air coverage dramatically improved convoy survival rates. American shipyards embraced the concept with characteristic industrial enthusiasm. The Maritime Commission identified C-3 cargo ship hulls suitable for conversion. These vessels, already in production for merchant service, could be modified into carriers without disrupting warship construction programs. The conversion process was remarkably efficient. A merchant hull would be modified with a flight deck, hangar deck, catapult, and minimal armament, creating a functional aircraft carrier in months rather than years required for purpose-built fleet carriers. The first American escort carrier, USS Long Island, commissioned in June 1941, proved the concept viable. She was followed by USS Charger, used primarily for training, and then by mass production of 2 classes that would define escort carrier operations. The Bogue class, built on C-3 hulls, displaced 11,420 tons and carried 28 aircraft. The Casablanca class, purpose-built rather than converted, became the most numerous carrier class ever constructed, with 50 vessels completed between July 1943 and July 1944. These production numbers reflected American industrial capacity operating at peak efficiency. Kaiser Shipbuilding's Vancouver yard could complete a Casablanca-class carrier in an average of 3 months from keel laying to commissioning. By comparison, a fleet carrier required 2 to 3 years to build. This production rate meant that losses could be quickly replaced and that sufficient numbers could be built to provide air coverage wherever needed. The specifications of escort carriers revealed design choices optimized for their mission rather than fleet operations. A typical Casablanca-class escort carrier was 512 feet long with a beam of 65 feet and displacement of 10,900 tons. Maximum speed was 19 knots, adequate for convoy work but far too slow for fleet operations, which required speeds exceeding 30 knots. Aircraft capacity varied by class but typically ranged from 24 to 28 aircraft. A Casablanca-class carrier normally operated 9 FM-2 Wildcat fighters and 12 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers. This was less than 1/3 the aircraft complement of a fleet carrier, but sufficient for anti-submarine patrols and convoy air defense. The flight deck measured approximately 475 feet in length, barely adequate for launching and recovering aircraft. Takeoffs required full engine power and every available foot of deck. Landings demanded precision from pilots accustomed to the generous dimensions of fleet carrier decks. Accidents were frequent, particularly in rough seas where the small hull pitched and rolled violently. Armor protection was minimal. The flight deck was wooden planking laid over steel support beams. Hangar decks lacked the armored overhead found on fleet carriers. Hull plating was merchant ship thickness, adequate for structural integrity but offering no protection against torpedoes or bombs. A single torpedo hit could prove fatal, as Japanese admirals correctly assessed. Defensive armament consisted primarily of anti-aircraft guns. A typical load included 1 5-inch gun, 16 40mm Bofors guns, and 20 20mm Oerlikon cannons. This was adequate against aircraft but useless in surface engagements. An escort carrier could not defend itself against even destroyer-class vessels, much less cruisers or battleships. These limitations seem to confirm Japanese assessments that escort carriers were emergency expedients rather than effective warships. Japanese intelligence reports noted the slow speed, light armament, and vulnerability, concluding that these vessels represented American industrial capacity producing quantity without quality. What these assessments missed was that escort carriers were designed for missions where these supposed weaknesses were irrelevant. Anti-submarine warfare required sustained air coverage over convoy routes and patrol areas. Speed was less important than endurance, and the ability to maintain aircraft aloft for extended periods. Heavy armament was unnecessary when the primary enemy was submarines attacking from beneath the surface. Vulnerability to surface attack mattered little when operating in zones where enemy surface vessels could not reach. The tactical employment of escort carriers reflected clear understanding of their capabilities and limitations. Rather than operating as individual units, escort carriers formed the nucleus of hunter-killer groups designed specifically for anti-submarine warfare. A typical group consisted of 1 escort carrier and 4 to 6 destroyer escorts, creating an integrated team optimized for locating and destroying submarines. The carrier provided air coverage, launching aircraft that could search vast ocean areas impossible for surface vessels to patrol effectively. TBM Avengers, equipped with radar, sonobuoys, depth charges, and later acoustic homing torpedoes, could detect submarines on the surface or submerged, attack them directly, or vector surface vessels to contact. The destroyer escorts provided sonar coverage, direct attack capability with depth charges and hedgehog mortars, and rescue operations when submarines surfaced. This combination proved devastatingly effective. Aircraft forced submarines to remain submerged, where their speed and effectiveness were severely limited. Surface vessels conducted precise attacks guided by aircraft observation. The hunter-killer group could prosecute contacts for hours or days, maintaining pressure until the submarine was destroyed or forced to surface where it could be sunk by gunfire. The first American hunter-killer group formed around USS Bogue departed Norfolk on March 1, 1943. Commander Howard Avery commanded the carrier with 4 destroyer escorts under tactical control. Their mission was to patrol the mid-Atlantic, providing air coverage in zones where U-boats had previously operated with impunity beyond the range of land-based aircraft. On March 22, Bogue's aircraft located U-boat U-665 on the surface, charging batteries. The submarine crash-dived, but not before aircraft marked its position. Destroyer escorts arrived within 20 minutes and conducted depth-charge attacks guided by the circling aircraft. U-665 surfaced damaged and was sunk by gunfire. It was the first U-boat kill credited to an American escort carrier group, validating the tactical concept and operational doctrine. Over the following months, Bogue and her aircraft accounted for 13 confirmed U-boat kills, making her the most successful anti-submarine carrier of the Atlantic campaign. Her success demonstrated that relatively small carriers operating specialized aircraft in coordinated groups could achieve results far exceeding their modest specifications. Japanese naval intelligence received reports of American escort carrier operations in the Atlantic, but these assessments reinforced rather than challenged existing prejudices. The vessels remained too slow, too vulnerable, too limited in aircraft capacity to matter in Pacific operations where distances were greater and the threat environment included land-based aviation and surface forces. The possibility that these carriers might be employed in similar hunter-killer roles against Japanese submarines received minimal consideration. This blindness reflected deeper assumptions about submarine warfare's role. Japanese submarines were assigned offensive missions against warships rather than merchant vessels. The I-class submarines, among the largest ever built, carried reconnaissance floatplanes and were designed for extended patrols attacking enemy naval forces. The concept of defensive anti-submarine operations protecting one's own merchant fleet remained undeveloped in Japanese doctrine. American submarines, by contrast, were systematically destroying Japanese merchant shipping throughout 1943. The Maru were dying by the dozens each month. Tankers, freighters, transports, sending raw materials, supplies, and eventually soldiers to the bottom of the Pacific. This campaign would ultimately prove more decisive than any fleet engagement, strangling Japan's war economy and isolating island garrisons. Yet the Imperial Japanese Navy continued to deploy submarines offensively against increasingly well-defended American task forces while neglecting the convoy protection that might have preserved their maritime economy. This fundamental misunderstanding of modern naval warfare's economic dimension would prove as costly as any tactical defeat. By summer 1943, the United States Navy had refined escort carrier operations into a systematic campaign against Axis submarines. The Atlantic successes provided operational templates that would be adapted for Pacific deployment. The differences in theater characteristics required modifications to tactics and equipment. But the fundamental concept remained valid. Sustained air coverage over vast ocean areas would force submarines to remain submerged, reducing their effectiveness and creating opportunities for destruction. The training regimen for escort carrier crews reflected the specialized nature of their mission. Unlike fleet carrier aviators who trained for strike operations against enemy naval forces, escort carrier pilots specialized in anti-submarine warfare, navigation over featureless ocean, and close coordination with surface vessels. Flight training emphasized low-altitude search patterns, radar operation, and attack profiles against submarine-sized targets rather than ships or aircraft. TBM Avenger crews trained extensively in radar operation. The ASV radar, mounted in a pod beneath the aircraft's wing, could detect surfaced submarines at ranges exceeding 10 miles under favorable conditions. Operators learned to distinguish submarine contacts from waves, debris, and radar returns from friendly vessels. This required hundreds of hours of practice. The engagement off Samar, though tactically disastrous for the escort carriers involved, strategically validated their versatility. Vessels designed for anti-submarine warfare had confronted battleships and survived long enough to disrupt Japanese operational plans. The aircraft they launched, though lacking armor-piercing bombs suitable for attacking capital ships, conducted attacks with such determination that Kurita believed he faced fleet carriers rather than escort vessels. This psychological impact, the willingness of escort carrier crews to engage forces that should have annihilated them, demonstrated qualities that no amount of armor or speed could provide. The escort carriers that survived the engagement returned to their primary mission within days. USS Kalinin Bay, hit by multiple shells during the battle, underwent repairs at Manus and was operational again by early November. Her aircraft resumed anti-submarine patrols and close air support missions, as though the dramatic surface engagement had been merely an interruption of normal operations. This rapid return to duty exemplified the resilience that mass production and standardized design provided. Japanese assessments of the Samar engagement focused on tactical questions about why Admiral Kurita withdrew rather than destroying the escort carriers completely. The strategic implications received less attention. That escort carriers, the vessels Japanese doctrine had dismissed as inadequate, could survive engagement with battleships and heavy cruisers, suggested that Japanese understanding of naval warfare remained incomplete even as the war approached its final phase. The final months of the Pacific War saw escort carriers operating in roles that would have seemed impossible in 1942. They provided continuous air coverage over the invasion of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, conducted anti-kamikaze patrols, supported minesweeping operations, and transported aircraft and supplies to forward bases. Their numbers ensured that losses could be absorbed without compromising operations. When USS Bismarck C was sunk by kamikaze attack off Iwo Jima in February 1945, she was the last American aircraft carrier sunk during the war, but her loss barely affected operational tempo. The contrast with Japanese carrier losses could not have been more pronounced. Japan began the war with 10 aircraft carriers and built or converted 14 more during the conflict. By war's end, all had been sunk or damaged beyond repair. The United States commissioned 151 aircraft carriers during the war, including 24 fleet carriers and 127 escort carriers. This industrial disparity, symbolized by the humble escort carrier that Japanese admirals had mocked, represented the material advantage that would prove decisive. The statistics documenting escort carrier effectiveness accumulated into an undeniable record. The 50 ships of the Casablanca class, built in just 18 months, collectively flew more than 300,000 sorties during the war. They provided air coverage for every major amphibious operation from North Africa through Okinawa. They transported more than 60,000 replacement aircraft to forward bases, ensuring that fleet carriers and land-based squadrons maintained operational strength. They conducted thousands of anti-submarine patrols that forced Axis submarines into defensive postures from which they never recovered. Production records revealed the industrial achievement these vessels represented. Kaiser Shipbuilding's Vancouver yard employed more than 15,000 workers at peak production. The yard launched a Casablanca-class carrier every 8 to 10 days during peak periods in late 1943 and early 1944. Each carrier required approximately 250,000 man-hours to construct, far less than the 2 million man-hours needed for a fleet carrier. This efficiency meant that American shipyards could produce escort carriers while simultaneously building fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and hundreds of merchant vessels. Japanese industry lacked both the capacity and the strategic vision to replicate such production. Japanese escort carriers, converted from various merchant vessels and auxiliary ships, numbered only 7 throughout the war. These vessels served primarily as aircraft transports rather than operational carriers, reflecting continued emphasis on fleet carriers for combat operations. The concept of mass-producing simple carriers optimized for specific missions never gained traction in Japanese naval planning, which remained focused on quality over quantity and decisive battle over sustained operations. The final tabulation of submarine losses told the strategic story. Germany began the war with 57 U-boats and built 1,131 more during the conflict. Allied forces sank 783 U-boats, with escort carriers and their aircraft claiming 57 confirmed kills. Japan began with 63 submarines and built 111 more. American forces sank 128 Japanese submarines, with escort carriers claiming or assisting in at least 15 kills. These numbers represented more than vessels destroyed. Each submarine sunk meant experienced crews lost, technological knowledge eliminated, and strategic capabilities diminished. Submarines required extensive training periods to reach operational effectiveness. Crew casualties could not be quickly replaced. The attrition that escort carriers and their hunter-killer groups inflicted was cumulative, progressive, and ultimately fatal to Axis submarine warfare. The human cost of these operations appeared in casualty reports from both sides. American escort carrier crews suffered losses disproportionate to their numbers. The small size and light construction of escort carriers meant that hits from torpedoes, bombs, or kamikaze aircraft often proved fatal. 5 escort carriers were sunk during the war, with total casualties exceeding 700 killed. Yet these losses, though tragic for the crews and families involved, represented acceptable attrition given the strategic results achieved. Japanese submarine crews faced far higher casualty rates. Of approximately 15,000 Japanese submariners who served during the war, fewer than 3,000 survived. This 80% casualty rate exceeded losses in any other branch of Japanese military service. The sustained pressure that escort carrier hunter-killer groups maintained contributed directly to these losses, forcing submarines into situations where survival became increasingly unlikely. The psychological dimensions of sustained anti-submarine operations emerged in post-war interviews with survivors from both sides. American escort carrier crews described the satisfaction of prosecuting contacts to successful conclusions, the frustration when submarines escaped after hours of searching, and the grim awareness that each kill meant dozens of enemy sailors drowning in waters hundreds of fathoms deep. The moral complexity of anti-submarine warfare, where victory meant causing slow death by drowning or crushing at depth, affected some crews deeply despite their professional commitment to the mission. Japanese submarine survivors described experiences that bordered on psychological torture, being hunted for hours or days, unable to surface, unable to fight effectively, waiting for the next depth charge pattern while air supplies diminished and battery power drained, and created stress that exceeded most combat experiences. Some survivors reported that crew members had collapsed from fear and exhaustion before their submarines were finally sunk. Others described captains who had become increasingly erratic under sustained pressure, making decisions that endangered their vessels further. The post-war analysis conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey examined all aspects of the Pacific War, including naval operations. The survey's assessment of escort carrier effectiveness concluded that these vessels had achieved strategic impact far exceeding their modest specifications and original mission parameters. The report noted that escort carriers had proven adaptable to multiple roles, had been produced in quantities that ensured sustained presence throughout all theaters, and had demonstrated that specialized vessels optimized for specific missions often achieved better results than multi-purpose vessels attempting multiple roles. Japanese post-war analyses reached similar conclusions from the opposite perspective. The reports prepared for Allied occupation authorities acknowledged that Japanese naval doctrine had underestimated the importance of convoy protection, anti-submarine warfare, and sustained air coverage over extended ocean areas. The dismissal of escort carriers as inadequate emergency conversions had been based on assumptions about naval warfare that proved incorrect when tested by combat experience. Most critically, Japanese naval officers recognized in retrospect that their doctrine's emphasis on decisive battle had blinded them to the economic warfare that ultimately proved decisive. While Japanese submarines conducted offensive operations against increasingly well-defended American task forces, American submarines and anti-submarine forces systematically destroyed Japan's merchant fleet and the submarines that might have protected it. By the time Japanese planners recognized this strategic error, circumstances made correction impossible. The transformation in naval aviation doctrine that escort carriers represented extended beyond their immediate wartime impact. Post-war carrier development incorporated lessons learned from escort carrier operations. The principle that specialized vessels optimized for specific missions could be more effective than fewer multi-purpose vessels influenced carrier design through the Cold War era. Light carriers, helicopter carriers, and amphibious assault ships all traced conceptual lineage to the escort carriers of World War II. The Korean War saw surviving escort carriers return to active service, providing close air support for United Nations forces and conducting anti-submarine patrols. Several remained in service through the 1950s, with the last, USS Sicily, not decommissioned until 1954. Their longevity demonstrated that vessels initially conceived as emergency wartime expedients had genuine operational value in sustained peacetime service. The industrial legacy proved equally significant. The production techniques developed for escort carrier construction influenced post-war shipbuilding throughout American industry. Modular construction, prefabrication of major components, and assembly line methods refined during escort carrier production were applied to merchant ship construction in the post-war period. Kaiser Shipbuilding, which had produced 50 Casablanca-class carriers, transitioned to merchant vessel construction using the same techniques, helping establish American dominance in commercial shipbuilding through the 1950s. The strategic lesson that emerged from escort carrier operations resonated through subsequent decades of military planning. Quantity has a quality all its own when vessels are adequate for their assigned missions. The American approach of producing large numbers of specialized vessels designed for specific roles proved more effective than the Japanese and German emphasis on fewer but more capable multi-purpose vessels. This lesson would be repeatedly validated in subsequent conflicts, where sustained presence and operational tempo mattered more than individual vessel capabilities. The human stories behind these strategic outcomes remained largely unknown to the public. Escort carrier crews received less attention than their fleet carrier counterparts, who conducted dramatic strikes against Japanese targets. Anti-submarine warfare lacked the photogenic drama of carrier aviation strikes or surface engagements. The escort carrier sailor who maintained monotonous patrol stations day after day, searching vast ocean areas for submarines that might never appear, epitomized unglamorous but essential military service. Yet these sailors understood their contribution. They knew that every submarine located and destroyed meant merchant vessels that would reach port safely, supplies that would arrive at forward bases, and operations that could proceed without interruption. They recognized that their unglamorous mission protected American logistics from the attrition that had nearly defeated Britain in the Atlantic. Their professional pride came not from dramatic victories but from sustained effectiveness at missions that required patience, technical competence, and determination to prosecute contacts, regardless of conditions or duration. Commander Daniel Gallery, who had commanded USS Guadalcanal during her capture of U-505, later wrote that escort carrier operations represented American industrial democracy applied to naval warfare, the same society that had mass-produced automobiles, appliances, and consumer goods, applied those techniques to producing warships in quantities that overwhelmed enemies who still built vessels as though each was unique. The escort carrier embodied this philosophy: adequate rather than excellent, numerous rather than rare, effective rather than impressive. This democratic approach to military production offended traditionalists in all navies who valued craftsmanship, individual excellence, and the romance of purpose-built warships. Japanese naval officers, trained to revere fleet carriers as floating temples of aviation power, found escort carriers aesthetically offensive as well as militarily inadequate. That these humble vessels proved strategically decisive challenged assumptions about the nature of naval power and the relationship between quality and quantity in modern warfare. The final irony appeared in post-war economic development. Japan's post-war industrial revival emphasized exactly the mass production techniques and democratic industrial philosophy that had enabled American escort carrier production. Japanese shipyards that had struggled to produce 7 escort carriers during the war became post-war leaders in commercial shipbuilding, applying American production methods to achieve efficiency and quality simultaneously. The student had learned from defeat lessons that would enable future success. Standing on the flight deck of USS Midway, now a museum ship in San Diego, visitors can observe the massive scale of a fleet carrier. The flight deck stretches nearly 1,000 feet, the hangar bay can accommodate dozens of aircraft, and the armored hull speaks to the vessel's designed survivability. These characteristics made fleet carriers formidable weapons platforms that dominated naval warfare for decades. Yet understanding World War II's Pacific naval campaign requires recognizing that the humble escort carrier, mocked by Japanese admirals as inadequate, accomplished strategic missions that fleet carriers could not have achieved given their numbers and operational requirements. The escort carriers provided sustained presence over vast ocean areas, conducted unglamorous but essential anti-submarine operations, and demonstrated that specialized vessels optimized for specific missions often outperform multi-purpose vessels attempting multiple roles. The 57 Axis submarines that escort carriers sank or helped destroy represented only part of their contribution. The thousands of anti-submarine patrols that found no contacts still provided protection by forcing submarines to operate defensively. The air coverage over convoys that never saw enemy action still ensured that merchant vessels reached port safely. The close air support missions over beachheads, the kamikaze patrols, the aircraft transport runs, all these missions added to strategic impact that far exceeded what Japanese planners had thought possible from vessels they dismissed. The transformation from mockery to respect, from dismissal to acknowledgement of effectiveness, required hard evidence purchased at the cost of destroyed submarines and drowned crews. Japanese naval officers who survived the war understood in retrospect that their initial assessments had been catastrophically wrong. The escort carriers they had dismissed as evidence of American desperation were actually evidence of American strategic clarity, the understanding that modern naval warfare required sustained presence over vast areas more than it required, dramatic striking power concentrated in elite units. This lesson resonates beyond World War II into contemporary military planning. The tension between quality and quantity, between specialized and multi-purpose vessels, between dramatic capability and sustained presence, continues to shape naval procurement and doctrine. The escort carrier's example suggests that the answers depend on specific missions, strategic requirements, and industrial capacity, rather than abstract principles about military excellence. The sailors who served aboard escort carriers understood their vessels' limitations. They knew they operated the Navy's smallest, slowest, most vulnerable carriers. They understood that fleet carrier aviators looked down on them as second-rate, yet they also knew they were achieving strategic results that mattered. Every patrol they flew, every submarine they sank or forced to remain submerged, every convoy they protected contributed to victory in ways that could not be measured by dramatic battle statistics. Their legacy endures not in monuments or popular histories, but in the quiet effectiveness of their service. They demonstrated that warfare's outcome often depends less on dramatic battles than on sustained competence at unglamorous missions. They proved that, industrial capacity intelligently applied could overwhelm tactical brilliance and operational art. They showed that vessels dismissed as inadequate could prove decisive when employed, according to realistic assessment of capabilities, rather than romantic notions of naval warfare. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. Interpreting grainy radar screens, where meaningful targets appeared as slight variations in background clutter. Sonobuoy operation added another technical dimension. These expendable acoustic sensors, dropped from aircraft into the ocean, transmitted underwater sounds to receivers aboard the aircraft. Submarine propellers, diesel engines, and even electric motors produced distinctive acoustic signatures that trained operators could identify. Multiple sonobuoys dropped in pattern could triangulate a submarine's position even when submerged, guiding attack runs or vectoring surface vessels to contact. Weapons training emphasized precision delivery of depth charges and later acoustic homing torpedoes. The Mark 24 mine, actually an air-dropped acoustic torpedo, entered service in March 1943. This weapon, code-named Fido, could home on submarine propeller noise, dramatically increasing the probability of kills against submerged targets. Air crews trained in proper release parameters, distinguishing friendly vessel signatures from enemy submarines, and coordinating multiple aircraft attacks. The destroyer escorts that formed the surface component of hunter-killer groups underwent equally intensive training. Sonar operators practiced classifying contacts, distinguishing submarines from schools of fish, thermal layers, and bottom returns. Attack doctrine emphasized sustained prosecution of contacts rather than single depth charge patterns. Hedgehog mortars, which threw patterns of contact-fused projectiles ahead of attacking vessels, allowed attacks without losing sonar contact that depth charges dropped astern would cause. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The deployment of escort carriers to the Pacific theater began in earnest during 1944 as production reached its peak and Atlantic requirements decreased following the defeat of the U-boat offensive. The tactical environment differed significantly from the Atlantic. Distances were greater, requiring longer-range patrols. Japanese submarines operated differently than German U-boats, favoring offensive patrols against warships rather than systematic interdiction of merchant shipping. Yet American merchant losses to Japanese submarines remained substantial enough to warrant countermeasures. Between December 1941 and August 1945, Japanese submarines sank 184 American merchant vessels, totaling 1,200,000 tons. While this represented only a fraction of the devastation German U-boats inflicted in the Atlantic, each sinking meant lost supplies, delayed operations, and dead merchant seamen. The USS Guadalcanal, a Casablanca-class escort carrier commissioned in September 1943, exemplified the transition from Atlantic to Pacific operations. Under Captain Daniel Gallery, Guadalcanal operated in the Atlantic through spring 1944, achieving fame for capturing U-505 inches. June 1944, the first enemy warship captured by the United States Navy since 1815. Gallery's aggressive tactics emphasized sustained pursuit of submarine contacts, regardless of sea conditions or operational constraints. His doctrine held that every contact should be prosecuted until the submarine was confirmed, destroyed, or definitely escaped. This aggressive mindset would be replicated by escort carrier groups deploying to the Pacific, where Japanese submarine activity threatened supply lines, supporting the island-hopping campaign. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated how escort carriers had evolved beyond their original convoy protection role. While fleet carriers engaged Japanese naval aviation in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, escort carriers provided anti-submarine screens, combat air patrol over amphibious forces, and close air support for ground operations. Their flexibility and numbers allowed task force commanders to assign them missions that would have required fleet carriers in earlier operations. USS Anzio, operating off Saipan during the invasion, maintained continuous air coverage over the amphibious transport area throughout daylight hours. Her FM-2 Wildcats intercepted Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, attempting to locate the invasion fleet. Her TBM Avengers conducted anti-submarine patrols that forced Japanese submarines to remain submerged and ineffective. When Marine units ashore requested air support, Anzio's aircraft provided close air support with rockets and bombs, demonstrating versatility that Japanese planners had not anticipated from vessels they dismissed as inadequate. The statistical impact of escort carrier operations became undeniable by late 1944. United States Navy records document that escort carriers and their aircraft were credited with sinking or assisting in the destruction of 57 Axis submarines during World War II. This figure includes both Atlantic and Pacific operations, with 26 confirmed kills by escort carrier aircraft alone, and another 31 where escort carrier groups participated in joint operations with surface vessels or land-based aircraft. These numbers represented significant attrition against submarine forces that both Germany and Japan struggled to replace. Each submarine required months to construct, extensive crew training, and represented substantial industrial investment. The loss of experienced crews was particularly damaging, as submarine operations demanded technical expertise and tactical judgment that could not be quickly replaced. Japanese submarine losses to American forces mounted steadily throughout 1944 and 1945. The Imperial Japanese Navy began the war with 63 ocean-going submarines. By war's end, 128 Japanese submarines had been sunk by American forces, with escort carrier groups claiming direct or assisted credit for at least 15 of these kills. The I-26, a Type B-1 submarine that had participated in reconnaissance operations before Pearl Harbor and later sank the carrier USS Juneau during the Guadalcanal campaign, was herself sunk by destroyer escort USS England in May 1944. England's commanding officer had been vectored to the contact area by aircraft from escort carrier USS Hoggart Bay, operating as part of a hunter-killer group. The coordinated search by carrier aircraft and prosecution by surface vessels exemplified the tactics that made escort carrier groups so effective. I-52, carrying strategic materials including 2 tons of gold intended for payment to Germany, was sunk by aircraft from USS Bogue in June 1944. The submarine had been located through signal intelligence and tracked by aircraft using radar and sonar buoys. The attack employed FIDO acoustic torpedoes dropped by TBM Avengers, which homed on the submarine's propeller noise and detonated against her hull at depth, causing catastrophic damage that sent her to the bottom with all hands. These individual kills accumulated into strategic impact. By 1945, Japanese submarines had been largely driven from offensive operations. American supply lines from Pearl Harbor to forward bases in the Marianas, Carolines, and Philippines operated with minimal interference from submarine attack. The contrast with 1942, when Japanese submarines had operated freely along American coastal waters and throughout the Pacific, could not have been more stark. The Japanese Navy's response to escort carrier operations revealed the institutional blindness that had led them to dismiss these vessels initially. Rather than developing countermeasures against anti-submarine hunter-killer groups, Japanese submarine doctrine continued emphasizing offensive operations against increasingly well-defended American task forces. I-class submarines, designed for extended-range offensive patrols, were expended in futile attacks against escort carriers, screening amphibious operations where destroyer escorts and continuous air patrols made successful attacks nearly impossible. Aro-class submarines, smaller coastal vessels more suitable for defensive operations, were assigned to static patrol zones around Japanese-held islands rather than deployed against American supply lines where they might have achieved better results. The fundamental misunderstanding of submarine warfare's economic dimension persisted until circumstances made correction impossible. Japanese submarine commanders who survived encounters with American escort carrier groups filed reports describing the tactical challenges they faced. Continuous air coverage forced submarines to remain submerged throughout daylight hours, limiting their ability to charge batteries, ventilate compartments, or maneuver at speeds necessary for intercepting targets. Radar-equipped aircraft could detect submarines on the surface before lookouts could spot aircraft, eliminating the warning time needed for crash dives. Most critically, the persistence of American hunter-killer groups meant that once detected, a submarine faced sustained attack that could last for hours or days. Unlike convoys that passed through an area and moved on, escort carrier groups remained in patrol zones, prosecuting every contact until resolved. Japanese submarine commanders described situations where they were forced to depths approaching crush limits, where battery power drained to critical levels, where air quality deteriorated until crew members collapsed, all while depth charges and hedgehog attacks continued overhead. The psychological toll of this sustained pressure contributed to declining effectiveness even among submarines that survived encounters. Crews that had endured prolonged depth charging exhibited symptoms that would later be recognized as combat stress reaction. Equipment pushed to operational limits suffered mechanical failures that could not be fully repaired at forward bases, lacking proper facilities. The cumulative attrition of sustained anti-submarine operations degraded Japanese submarine capability more effectively than individual sinkings alone could have achieved. By early 1945, American escort carriers had achieved such dominance in anti-submarine operations that their role shifted toward other missions. With Japanese submarines largely neutralized, escort carriers provided close air support for amphibious operations, conducted anti-shipping strikes against Japanese coastal vessels, and served as aircraft transports delivering replacement aircraft to forward bases. This operational flexibility demonstrated that these vessels, initially conceived for the single mission of convoy protection, could adapt to changing operational requirements. The Battle off Samar during the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 provided the most dramatic demonstration of escort carrier capabilities and limitations. Taffy 3, a group of 6 escort carriers with destroyer and destroyer escort screens, encountered Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, consisting of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The resulting engagement saw escort carriers designed for anti-submarine warfare facing the most powerful surface force the Japanese Navy could deploy. USS Gambier Bay was sunk by gunfire from Japanese heavy cruisers, becoming the only American aircraft carrier sunk by naval gunfire during World War II. 2 destroyer escorts and 1 destroyer were also lost in desperate attempts to defend the escort carriers. Yet Taffy 3's aircraft, launching with whatever weapons were available, conducted sustained attacks that contributed to Admiral Kurita's decision to withdraw, despite having overwhelming superiority. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.